There's a difference, Kale said quietly as he adjusted Aaron's grip on the wooden sword, between fighting because you're angry and fighting because you have something worth protecting. Morning light spilled through the trees behind Aaron's cottage, scattering soft gold across the clearing while the forest breathed around them, like something slowly waking from a long illness. The deeper roots no longer slept beneath the earth, but shifted subtly, with every pulse of life returning to the woods, and even the wind carried a strange awareness now. Kale had begun noticing it days ago. The forest responded differently whenever the children were near, especially when all three of them stood together. Aaron lunged again too quickly, stubborn determination written all over his face before Kale caught the wooden blade effortlessly with his own. Again, Kale said calmly. Aaron frowned but reset immediately, dark eyes burning with the same fierce instinct Kale sometimes saw reflected in mirrors. Nearby, Kale sat cross-legged atop a fallen log, absent-mindedly letting tiny roots curl around his fingers while pretending not to pay attention. The youngest rarely spoke much during training, but the forest itself seemed to listen whenever he did. Leora remained near Aaron beneath the shade of the porch roof, carefully sorting healing herbs into small bundles with quiet concentration far beyond her age. Every now and then, flowers growing near her feet opened slightly wider as if responding to her presence. Peace, fragile, temporary peace, and somehow that frightened Kale more than battle ever had. Because now he understood exactly what could be lost. Aaron watched them quietly from the porch, wrapped in a pale outer robe too thin for the morning chill. His long black hair fell loosely over one shoulder, soft against skin still carrying traces of exhaustion no amount of rest had truly erased. He looked healthier than he had weeks ago, but Kale noticed the truth hidden underneath more often now. The slight pause before Aaron stood, the way his breathing sometimes faltered after using too much energy, the faint trembling in his fingers whenever he thought no one was watching, and every single time Kale noticed, something inside him tightened painfully. He still could not remember everything. Memories remained fractured pieces buried beneath fog and broken dreams. But his body remembered Aaron. His instincts did. The pull toward him had become impossible to ignore. Kale blocked another strike from Aaron before lowering his sword slightly. Enough for today, already? Aaron protested immediately. Kale looked up from the roots around his hands while Leora hid a small smile behind the herbs she was wrapping. Kale almost smiled despite himself. You're improving too fast. That means we're strong, Aaron declared proudly. That means, Kale corrected, you're still children. Aaron groaned dramatically while Kale quietly whispered something to the roots beside him that made them curl tighter around the log in amusement. Behind them, Aaron laughed softly before quickly covering his mouth when the sound turned into a cough. Kale turned instantly. Aaron. The Omega shook his head lightly. I'm all right. Kale walked toward him anyway. Always toward him. The realization struck harder lately. Appearing in small moments Kale no longer knew how to explain. Every time he entered a room, his eyes searched for Aaron first. Every time danger rose, his body moved instinctively toward Aaron before thought could catch up. Every time Aaron looked tired, Kale felt restless in a way battle had never caused him before. He stopped in front of him now, crouching slightly to inspect the herbs in silence before finally asking, "Did you sleep at all?" Aaron avoided his gaze for half a second too long, enough to answer the question completely. Kale exhaled quietly. You can't keep draining yourself every day. Aaron smiled faintly. That sounds familiar. Kale frowned slightly. What does? Aaron's eyes softened in that quiet way that always made something ache strangely inside Kale's chest. You used to say that before too. Silence settled gently between them afterward. Not awkward, just full. Kale looked away first because he still hated how easily Aaron could make him feel like he had forgotten something precious. Nearby, Aaron suddenly blurted out, "Why do you always look for Papa first?" The clearing fell silent instantly. Even Kale looked up from the roots twisting around his fingers while Leora nearly dropped the herbs she was holding. Kale froze. Aaron blinked in surprise before lowering his gaze quickly, a faint warmth rising across his cheeks. Aaron immediately realized he had said something dangerous and looked mildly horrified with himself. I mean, not always. Kale tilted his head innocently. You do though, Leora quietly nodded in agreement, entirely unhelpful. Kale stared at them for a long second before unconsciously looking back toward Aaron again, directly proving their point. Aaron tried very hard not to smile. Kale cleared his throat and stood abruptly before he could embarrass himself further. Training's over. Aaron grinned victoriously while Kale's tiny roots curled happily around the log like they approved of the situation. Then the ground trembled beneath them. Once, deep and unnatural. Every soldier stationed near the clearing immediately went still. The forest had been warning them this way for days now. Danger. Kale's expression hardened instantly as he turned toward the outer woods. Moments later, Riven emerged from the eastern path at speed, one arm streaked with blood that clearly was not his own. The western barrier collapsed for 12 seconds last night. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Collapsed? Kale asked sharply. Suppressed. Riven corrected grimly. Someone's interfering with the synchronization pathways. Kale understood instantly. The mages. Beyond the clearing, another distant pulse shook the trees, stronger this time. Somewhere deep beneath the forest floor, ancient roots shifted violently like a wounded creature trying to wake. Aaron's face paled slightly. Kale slowly rose from the log, eyes fixed toward the deeper woods. The forest is scared, he whispered softly. Silence followed those words, because every single person there felt it too. Then another figure emerged between the trees. Enormous, silver-furred, a wolf nearly twice the size of a horse stepped into the clearing with glowing golden eyes fixed directly on Aaron. Behind it came more shapes moving silently. Through the mist, ancient deer crowned in moss and flowers, black birds circling overhead, roots twisting across the ground like veins beneath living skin. The forest was mobilizing. Even Kale felt the difference immediately. This was no longer a dying sanctuary trying to survive. This was a living force preparing for war. The silver wolf stopped directly before Aaron before lowering itself slightly, as if acknowledging him. Aaron stared openly in awe while Leora instinctively moved closer too. Aaron sighed. Kale simply watched in silence, almost as if he understood something the others did not. The outer lines are failing, Aaron whispered quietly. Fear flickered across his face before disappearing again beneath calm exhaustion. Kale saw it anyway. Always saw it. He stepped closer instinctively, close enough that the soft scent of Aaron's pheromones brushed against him naturally. Warm rain, leaves after storms, something painfully alive. Kale's own pheromones responded before thought. Grounding alpha energy spreading subtly into the air around them. Aaron visibly relaxed beneath it. Only slightly, but enough for Kale to notice. Enough for Leora to notice too. Judging by the tiny smile, she quickly hid behind her herbs. Riven very politely looked somewhere else entirely. Aaron looked deeply entertained. Kale ignored all of them. How long before they move? He asked. Riven's expression darkened. Not long. Another cold gust swept through the clearing then, somewhere far beyond. The forest borders, ancient ritual chambers tied to the core, were beginning to crack under unstable synchronization. For centuries, the Virulith family had controlled the core because the forest had been too weak to resist. But now the forest was waking again, and if it fully awakened, they would lose control forever. Kale stared toward the endless woods ahead, jaw tightening slowly as the roots beneath the earth pulsed like a living heartbeat preparing for war. For the first time since entering this forest, he no longer felt like a man hiding inside it. He felt like someone standing beside it. And somewhere beyond the borders, beneath black banners and fractured ritual circles, the Virulith elders had finally realized the same terrifying truth. The forest was fighting back. The forest moved before the enemy did. The warning came not from horns or shouting soldiers, but from the roots beneath the earth. One violent pulse rippled through the ground beneath Aaron's cottage, strong enough to shake dust from the wooden beams overhead. Every soldier stationed near the clearing froze immediately. They had learned the forest's language by now. Danger. Kale was already outside before the second tremor hit, sword strapped across his back while cold morning fog drifted unnaturally low through the trees. The air smelled wrong. Sharp magic. Ash. Corrupted mana. Behind him, Aaron stepped quietly onto the porch with Leora at his side while Aaron and Kale stood near the edge of the clearing watching the deeper woods in tense silence. Even the children could feel it now. The forest was afraid. Then Riven burst through the eastern path, blood streaked across one sleeve and breathing rough from running. The outer lines under attack. Kale's entire expression hardened instantly. How many? Enough to force the western barrier into partial collapse. Another tremor answered him from somewhere deeper within the forest, louder this time. Trees groaned violently in the distance while flocks of black birds exploded upward into the sky. Kale understood immediately. This was no scouting party anymore. The invasion had begun. Aaron's face paled slightly beside the porch railing as his fingers tightened against the wood. He could feel every rupture spreading through the forest like wounds carved directly into living flesh. Kale noticed instantly and moved half a step closer without thinking, placing himself subtly between Aaron and the direction of danger again. Instinct. Always instinct. Another soldier stumbled into the clearing moments later. Northern route breached. False breach. A second scout shouted behind him, nearly breathless. They forced us north and broke the southern flank instead. Kale cursed quietly under his breath. Coordinated misdirection. The mage was leading the assault personally. Of course he was. Pull everyone back to the second ring, Kale ordered. Sharply, do not split formations. If we retreat further, they'll advance faster, Riven warned. That's what they want, Kale replied immediately. He's forcing the forest to react incorrectly. Another explosion shook the western woods before anyone could answer. Crimson light flashed violently between the trees as unstable mage sigils burned through the fog like cracks spreading across glass. The forest reacted instantly. Roots burst upward from the ground, but several twisted the wrong direction entirely before slamming into neighboring trees instead of enemy soldiers. Pathways distorted. Barriers shifted incorrectly. The forest was beginning to attack itself. He's poisoning the synchronization network, Silvaris said grimly as he emerged from the treeline alongside his own forces. Silver sigils burned faintly along his gloves while his soldiers moved into defensive positions around the second ring. Kale glanced toward him briefly. You came. Silvaris's mouth curved faintly. I dislike dying. Not reassuring, but honest enough. Kale accepted it with a nod. There was no room left for pride or old grudges now. Another roar thundered through the forest suddenly. Deeper this time. Ancient. The silver wolf from the previous night burst from the trees, with several massive shadow wolves following behind it, their glowing eyes fixed toward the western line. Behind them came towering deer crowned in moss-covered antlers while black birds circled overhead in endless spirals. The forest was mobilizing completely now. Aaron stared openly in awe before tightening his grip on the small wooden blades still hanging at his side. They're all coming, he whispered. Kale slowly stepped closer to the edge of the clearing, silver-gray eyes unfocused as if listening to something no one else could hear. The forest is angry now. The roots beneath the ground pulsed violently in response to his words. Aaron inhaled sharply. Kale noticed the tremor in his breathing immediately. What is it? Aaron's voice came softer than before. The forest knows they're trying to reach me. Silence fell briefly after that, because everyone understood exactly what it meant. The mage had finally identified the true axis holding the forest together. Not the soldiers. Not even Kale himself. Aaron. Another pulse of crimson mana exploded across the battlefield beyond the trees before screams echoed through the western line. Real screams this time. Battle had fully reached the second ring. Positions. Riven shouted. Soldiers immediately moved while roots erupted upward across the clearing's edge, forming living barricades from wood and earth. Kale turned sharply toward Aaron. You stay behind the inner barrier. Aaron's brows pulled together faintly. Kale? Please. The word escaped before Kale could stop it, softer than command. Almost desperate. Aaron stared at him quietly for a long second before finally nodding once. Relief hit Kale harder than it should have. He turned immediately, before he could think too deeply about why. Then the enemy finally broke through the western mist. Armored riders crashed through the distorted forest pathways beneath black virolith banners, while crimson lanterns hanging from their saddles pulsed violently with corrupted mana. Everywhere the light touched, roots recoiled in pain. Massive vines twisted against themselves while entire sections of the forest barrier collapsed inward unnaturally. And behind them walked the mage, calm, untouched by the chaos around him. Glowing crimson sigils floated lazily around his hands while his eyes studied the forest like a man dissecting a living creature. Kale felt cold fury crawl beneath his skin instantly. "Hold the line!" he shouted before charging forward with Riven beside him. Battle exploded across the second ring. Steel clashed against roots and magic, while the forest itself joined the war completely. Giant thorn vines ripped soldiers from horseback, while wolves tore through shield formations with terrifying precision. Antlered beasts crashed through armored ranks like living battering rams. Overhead, black birds descended in violent swarms that blinded enemy archers before vanishing back into the smoke. Kale cut through his own family's soldiers with ruthless efficiency, every movement sharper than before, because now every strike carried something heavier than duty, protection. Another corrupted blast slammed into the battlefield suddenly, sending several soldiers crashing backward through shattered roots. One man stumbled toward the inner line, clutching a wound across his chest so deep he should have already been dead. Before anyone else could move, Leora ran forward instinctively. "Leora!" Aaron called sharply, fear flashing across his face. But the girl had already dropped beside the wounded soldier, trembling hands glowing with pale golden light as healing energy spread carefully into torn flesh. The soldier gasped violently as the bleeding slowed enough for him to breathe again. Nearby soldiers stared at her with stunned disbelief. Kale felt simultaneous pride and terror twist painfully through his chest. She was too young for this. All of them were. Another shout erupted from the southern flank, enemy riders breaking through. Aaron reacted before anyone could stop him. Both hands slammed against the earth instinctively. The ground exploded upward beneath the charging horses in a violent wave of stone and roots, splitting the enemy formation apart before they could reach the inner camp. Riders crashed sideways while roots immediately wrapped around shattered armor. Aaron staggered backward afterward, breathing hard from the effort, but still standing stubbornly in front of his siblings. Kale stared for half a second before something dangerously close to pride hit him again. Then Kale suddenly froze near the edge of the clearing. His expression changed instantly. "Someone's inside," he whispered. Kale's instincts screamed at him a heartbeat later. A Virulith assassin burst through the distorted pathways directly behind Aaron, blade coated in black mana aimed straight toward his throat. Too fast. Kale moved instantly, but he was too far away. Aaron turned. Too late. And Kale lifted his head. The battlefield froze, not physically, mentally. The assassin's body locked mid-motion as invisible pressure crushed violently through his mind, forcing every muscle in his body to seize for one impossible second. Enough. Kale reached him first. Steel flashed once through the smoke. The assassin dropped before his blade ever touched Aaron. The pressure vanished immediately afterward. Kale stumbled hard, blood suddenly running from one nostril, while Aaron caught him before he could collapse. "Enough," Aaron whispered shakily, holding him tightly against his chest while his own hands trembled harder than before. Kale reached them seconds later, dropping to one knee instantly. "Are you hurt?" Kale shook his head weakly before whispering softly, "I didn't want him to touch Papa." Something inside Kale nearly shattered at those words, because the child had not protected the forest, not the core, not the war. He had protected Aaron, just like Kale would have. Kale looked toward Aaron then, and suddenly another fractured memory struck without warning. Dark hair tangled between his fingers, soft laughter beneath candlelight. Aaron crying quietly while holding newborn children against his chest. Kale stumbling into the room terrified because he thought he had lost them. The memory vanished almost instantly, but the emotion remained sharp enough to steal the air from his lungs. "Kale?" Aaron whispered softly. Kale couldn't answer, because for one horrifying moment, losing Aaron had felt more real than the war itself. Then the forest roared. Not roots, not beasts. The trees themselves began moving. Ancient trunks groaned violently as entire sections of the forest shifted across the battlefield, crushing soldiers beneath living wood while pathways sealed shut around enemy formations. Overhead, thousands of black birds darkened the sky completely. Soldiers on both sides froze at the sight. The forest god, someone whispered in terror. Somewhere deep beneath the earth, the wounded pulse of the core thundered harder in response, resonating through every living thing connected to the forest. And for the first time since the invasion began, fear crossed the mage's face, because the forest was no longer dying quietly. It was waking up angry. The children of the forest are fighting. The words spread across the second ring in frightened whispers as battle consumed more and more of the outer woods. Soldiers repeated it to each other like a prayer, or perhaps a warning. Kale heard it every time another wounded fighter was dragged behind the living barricades, and every single time, something inside him tightened painfully, because they were children, because they should have been sleeping safely inside Aaron's cottage instead of standing in the middle of a war older than they even understood. Another pulse of corrupted mana exploded across the battlefield, violent enough to shake the roots beneath the earth itself. Trees groaned like wounded animals while the forest pathways twisted unnaturally under the mages. Interference. Kale cut through another virulent soldier before looking sharply toward the western line. The battle was worsening. Fast. Fall back to the ridge. Riven shouted to the remaining soldiers near the broken barrier while Silvaris's men reinforced the southern flank with glowing silver sigils carved directly into the ground. For one brief moment, it looked like the line might stabilize. Then the mage lifted one hand. Crimson fractures spread across the battlefield instantly, burning through the roots beneath the earth like poison entering veins. The forest reacted violently. Massive vines twisted against themselves while several ancient trees shifted in the wrong direction entirely before crashing down across allied formations instead of enemy soldiers. Chaos rippled outward immediately. He's destabilizing the living pathways, Silvaris said grimly. If this continues, the forest won't be able to distinguish ally from enemy. Kale's jaw tightened sharply. That was the true horror of the mage's power. Not destruction, but corruption, turning the forest against itself. Another explosion thundered from deeper within the western woods. Before a group of injured soldiers stumbled back toward the second ring covered in blood and shattered bark. One collapsed directly in front of Leora, gasping weakly while crimson corruption spread visibly through the wound across his shoulder. Without hesitation, Leora dropped beside him. Leora. Aaron started instinctively, fear flashing across his face, but the girl had already pressed trembling hands against the injury. Pale golden light spilled softly through her fingers while tiny flowers bloomed briefly through the cracked earth around her knees. The soldier cried out sharply before his breathing steadied enough to survive. Nearby soldiers stared openly now. Not at Aaron, not at Kale. At her. All beginning to replace fear. Kale felt pride and terror strike him simultaneously hard enough to almost hurt. She was too young for people to start looking at her like a miracle. Another violent crash shook the battlefield before anyone could speak. Enemy riders had broken through the eastern line. They're heading for the inner ring. Someone shouted. Aaron moved before Kale could stop him. Both hands slammed instinctively against the ground. The earth answered immediately. Roots and stone erupted upward in a massive wave beneath the charging cavalry, splitting their formation apart before they reached the inner camp. Horses screamed as riders were thrown violently sideways into twisting vines. Aaron staggered hard afterward, breathing unevenly from the strain, but still shoved himself protectively in front of his siblings. The second he regained balance, exactly like Kale would have. Kale stared at him for half a second too long before something dangerous tightened in his chest again. Pride, fear, love, all tangled together too tightly to separate anymore. Then Kale suddenly lifted his head sharply toward the deeper woods. His expression changed instantly. Pale, distant, listening. Someone's coming, he whispered softly. Inside the roots. Kale's instincts reacted immediately. Where? But Kale never answered, because the attack came first. A virulent assassin burst directly through a distorted forest pathway behind Aaron, blade coated in black mana aimed straight toward his heart. Too fast. Kale moved instantly, but the distance was still too far. Aaron turned too late, and Kale looked up. Silence slammed across the battlefield like impact. The assassin froze mid-step, every muscle locking violently beneath invisible pressure crushing through his mind. One impossible second. Enough! Kale reached him immediately, Steel flashed once through the smoke. The assassin collapsed before his blade ever touched Aaron. The pressure shattered instantly afterward. Kale stumbled violently, blood spilling suddenly from his nose while his entire body shook from the backlash. Aaron caught him before he could hit the ground. "Enough," Aaron whispered shakily, holding him tightly against his chest while his own hands trembled harder than before. Kale reached them seconds later and dropped instinctively to one knee beside them. "Kale." The boy blinked weakly before whispering softly, "I didn't want him to touch Papa." The words hit Kale harder than the battlefield itself, because Kale had not protected the forest, not the core, not the war. He had protected Aaron, exactly the way Kale himself would have. Kale looked toward Aaron instinctively then, and another fractured memory struck without warning. Aaron laughing softly beneath candlelight. Newborn cries echoing through a warm room. Tiny fingers wrapped around Kale's hand for the first time. Aaron exhausted but smiling while Kale kissed his forehead like the entire world existed only inside that room. The memory shattered almost immediately, but the emotion remained sharp enough to leave Kale breathless. Fear. Unbearable fear of losing them. "Kale?" Aaron whispered softly. Kale couldn't answer right away, because for one horrifying moment, the idea of Aaron dying had felt more real than the war surrounding them. Another roar thundered across the battlefield before the moment could settle. Deeper this time. Older. The entire forest shifted violently. Not roots, not vines. The trees themselves began moving. Ancient trunks groaned as living walls of wood crashed across enemy formations, while entire pathways sealed shut around advancing soldiers. Overhead, thousands of black birds darkened the sky completely, while shadow wolves tore through the broken western flank like living nightmares. Soldiers on both sides froze in terror at the sight. "The forest god," someone whispered. Somewhere beneath the earth, the pulse of the wounded core thundered violently in response, resonating through every root, every beast, every living thing tied to the forest. And for the first time since the invasion began, fear crossed the mage's face, because the forest was no longer trying to survive quietly anymore. It was waking up furious. "The children of the forest are fighting." The words spread across the second ring in frightened whispers as battle consumed more and more of the outer woods. Soldiers repeated it to each other like a prayer, or perhaps a warning. Kale heard it every time another wounded fighter was dragged behind the living barricades, and every single time, something inside him tightened painfully, because they were children. Because they should have been sleeping safely inside Aaron's cottage instead of standing in the middle of a war older than they even understood. Another pulse of corrupted mana exploded across the battlefield, violent enough to shake the roots beneath the earth itself. Trees groaned like wounded animals, while the forest pathways twisted unnaturally under the mage's interference. Kale cut through another virulent soldier before looking sharply toward the western line. The battle was worsening. Fast. Fall back to the ridge. Riven shouted to the remaining soldiers near the broken barrier while Silvarus's men reinforced the southern flank with glowing silver sigils carved directly into the ground. For one brief moment, it looked like the line might stabilize. Then the mage lifted one hand. Crimson fractures spread across the battlefield instantly, burning through the roots beneath the earth like poison entering veins. The forest reacted violently. Massive vines twisted against themselves while several ancient trees shifted in the wrong direction entirely before crashing down across allied formations instead of enemy soldiers. Chaos rippled outward immediately. "He's destabilizing the living pathways," Silvarus said grimly. "If this continues, the forest won't be able to distinguish ally from enemy." Kale's jaw tightened sharply. That was the true horror of the mage's power. Not destruction, but corruption, turning the forest against itself. Another explosion thundered from deeper within the western woods. Before a group of injured soldiers stumbled back toward the second ring covered in blood and shattered bark. One collapsed directly in front of Leora, gasping weakly, while crimson corruption spread visibly through the wound across his shoulder. Without hesitation, Leora dropped beside him. "Leora." Aaron started instinctively, fear flashing across his face, but the girl had already pressed trembling hands against the injury. Pale golden light spilled softly through her fingers while tiny flowers bloomed briefly through the cracked earth around her knees. The soldier cried out sharply before his breathing steadied enough to survive. Nearby soldiers stared openly now. Not at Aaron, not at Kale, at her. All beginning to replace fear. Kale felt pride and terror. Strike him simultaneously hard enough to almost hurt. She was too young for people to start looking at her like a miracle. Another violent crash shook the battlefield before anyone could speak. Enemy riders had broken through the eastern line. They're heading for the inner ring, someone shouted. Aaron moved before Kale could stop him. Both hands slammed instinctively against the ground. The earth answered immediately. Roots and stone erupted upward in a massive wave beneath the charging cavalry, splitting their formation apart before they reached the inner camp. Horses screamed as riders were thrown violently sideways into twisting vines. Aaron staggered hard afterward, breathing unevenly from the strain, but still shoved himself protectively in front of his siblings the second he regained balance. Exactly like Kale would have. Kale stared at him for half a second too long before something dangerous tightened in his chest again. Pride, fear, love, all tangled together too tightly to separate anymore. Then Kale suddenly lifted his head sharply toward the deeper woods. His expression changed instantly. Pale, distant, listening. Someone's coming, he whispered softly. Inside the roots, Kale's instincts reacted immediately. Where? But Kale never answered, because the attack came first. A virulent assassin burst directly through a distorted forest pathway behind Aaron, blade coated in black mana aimed straight toward his heart. Too fast. Kale moved instantly, but the distance was still too far. Aaron turned too late, and Kale looked up. Silence slammed across the battlefield like impact. The assassin froze mid-step, every muscle locking violently beneath invisible pressure. Crushing through his mind. One impossible second. Enough? Kale reached him immediately. Steel flashed once through the smoke. The assassin collapsed before his blade ever touched Aaron. The pressure shattered instantly afterward. Kale stumbled violently, blood spilling suddenly from his nose while his entire body shook from the backlash. Aaron caught him before he could hit the ground. Enough? Aaron whispered shakily, holding him tightly against his chest while his own hands trembled harder than before. Kale reached them seconds later and dropped instinctively to one knee beside them. Kale. The boy blinked weakly before whispering softly. I didn't want him to touch Papa. The words hit Kale harder than the battlefield itself, because Kale had not protected the forest, not the core, not the war. He had protected Aaron, exactly the way Kale himself would have. Kale looked toward Aaron instinctively then, and another fractured memory struck without warning. Aaron laughing softly beneath candlelight, newborn cries echoing through a warm room. Tiny fingers wrapped around Kale's hand for the first time. Aaron exhausted but smiling while Kale kissed his forehead like the entire world existed only inside that room. The memory shattered almost immediately, but the emotion remained sharp enough to leave Kale breathless. Fear. Unbearable fear of losing them. Kale? Aaron whispered softly. Kale couldn't answer right away, because for one horrifying moment, the idea of Aaron dying had felt more real than the war surrounding them. Another roar thundered across the battlefield before the moment could settle. Deeper this time. Older, the entire forest shifted violently. Not roots, not vines. The trees themselves began moving. Ancient trunks groaned as living walls of wood crashed across enemy formations, while entire pathways sealed shut around advancing soldiers. Overhead, thousands of black birds darkened the sky completely, while shadow wolves tore through the broken western flank like living nightmares. Soldiers on both sides froze in terror at the sight. The forest god, someone whispered. Somewhere beneath the earth, the pulse of the wounded core thundered violently in response, resonating through every root, every beast, every living thing tied to the forest. And for the first time since the invasion began, fear crossed the mage's face, because the forest was no longer trying to survive quietly anymore. It was waking up furious. No one spoke during the burial. Smoke still drifted through the shattered western woods while rain fell softly across the clearing, washing blood into the torn earth beneath the roots. The battle had ended hours ago, but the forest still trembled beneath every step like a wounded creature unable to rest. Several soldiers stood silently beneath blackened trees holding torches that hissed faintly in the rain, while bodies wrapped in rough cloth lay side by side along the ridge overlooking the broken barrier. Too many bodies. Kale stood near the front of the line with dried blood still streaked across his hands, exhaustion dragging heavily against every movement, but none of it compared to the weight settling slowly inside his chest as he looked down at the fallen. They had survived another assault. Barely. Riven stepped beside him quietly after a long silence. 23 dead. Kale closed his eyes briefly. And the wounded? More than we can properly treat. Another pause. Heavier this time. We lost the western watchtower too. Kale nodded once without answering. Because there was nothing left to say. They were losing ground. Slowly. Painfully. But undeniably. Nearby, Leora knelt beside one of the injured soldiers trying carefully to change the bandages around his arm, while Aaron rested weakly against the trunk of a massive tree nearby, watching over her despite barely having enough strength to remain awake. Himself, Kale's gaze drifted toward them instinctively. Always toward them. Aaron looked pale enough now that even the rain seemed afraid to touch him too harshly. Dark circles shadowed beneath his eyes, while faint trembling still lingered in his fingers from overusing his healing energy throughout the night. Every soldier there could see it. Every single one of them understood exactly how much of himself Aaron had already sacrificed to keep them alive. And still he continued. Kale hated it. Hated how helpless it made him feel watching Aaron slowly burn himself away one wounded soldier at a time. Another soldier cried out suddenly from farther down the line, as corrupted mana spread across an untreated wound. Leora immediately moved toward him before Kale stopped her gently by the wrist. Enough. The little girl looked up at him in surprise. But he's hurting. Kale crouched slightly in front of her, forcing himself to keep his voice calm. So are you. Leora's eyes lowered quietly, because she knew he was right. Pale golden light still flickered weakly around her fingertips even now, unstable from exhaustion. She had healed too many people already. Kale brushed damp hair carefully away from her face before speaking more softly. You did enough today. For 1 second, Leora looked so heartbreakingly young that Kale felt something crack painfully beneath his ribs again. War had stolen childhood from all three of them far too quickly. Nearby, Aaron sat silently near the ruined barricade, sharpening a broken blade someone had given him earlier despite the bruises darkening his arms and shoulders. He had barely spoken since the battle ended. Kale recognized the expression on his face immediately. Guilt. The dangerous kind. The kind Kale himself had carried for years. Farther away, Kale sat cross-legged beside the roots near the edge of the clearing with his eyes closed tightly. Listening again. Always listening. Except this time tears slid silently down his cheeks while the roots around him trembled faintly beneath the rain. Aaron noticed too. Of course he noticed. The Omega slowly pushed himself upright despite exhaustion and walked carefully toward the youngest child. Kale instinctively moved to help him before stopping himself halfway. Aaron reached Kale slowly, before kneeling beside him with visible effort. Kale, the boy opened his eyes weakly, silver-gray irises shimmering with something far too old for a child. They're crying, he whispered softly. Aaron's expression tightened painfully. Who is? Kale looked toward the darkened woods beyond the ruined barrier. The trees. Silence fell again after that, because deep down, everyone nearby understood. He was telling the truth. The forest was mourning too. Another cold wind swept through the clearing then, carrying the distant sound of cracking wood from somewhere far beyond the western line. Even now the forest was still trying to rebuild itself between attacks, still trying to protect them despite how much it was bleeding. Kale looked toward the ruined trees standing blackened against the rain and suddenly understood something horrifying. The forest was not dying because it lacked power. It was dying because it kept giving that power away to protect them. Kale. He turned immediately at the sound of Aaron's voice. The Omega was still kneeling beside Kale now, but his breathing had become uneven again. Kale crossed the distance instantly. What happened? Aaron shook his head lightly, though his face had gone noticeably paler. Too many pathways are damaged. His voice sounded strained now. Weak. The synchronization is collapsing faster. Kale's jaw tightened sharply. Every time the forest pathways broke apart, Aaron felt it directly through the connection binding him to the forest, and the damage was spreading faster now. Another soldier stumbled into the clearing suddenly, covered in blood and rainwater. Enemy movement from the south. Riven reacted immediately. Already? Not a full assault. The scout answered breathlessly. Smaller units. Assassins maybe. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Kale's expression darkened. The mage had changed tactics. Frontal attacks were weakening the forest too slowly. Now they were hunting strategically. Eren, the children. Key synchronization points. Sylvaris appeared beside the damaged barrier a moment later. Rain dripping slowly from dark silver armor, while several of his men dragged wounded soldiers behind them. There. Probing for openings, he said quietly. Testing response time. Kale looked toward the trembling roots beneath the clearing. Slower now. Weaker. Sylvaris followed his gaze briefly before speaking again. The forest won't survive another prolonged siege. The words landed heavily because no one there could deny them anymore. Another distant scream echoed through the rain from somewhere deeper in the forest. Everyone turned instantly. Then a second scream followed. Closer. Kale reached for his sword immediately. Riven with me. Several soldiers moved instantly. But before Kale could leave, Leora suddenly grabbed the edge of his sleeve. Don't let anyone die anymore. The words hit harder than they should have coming from such a small voice. Kale looked down at her quietly for a moment before kneeling slightly to meet her eyes. Rainwater clung to her lashes while fear trembled visibly. Beneath the calm expression she was trying so hard to maintain, she looked too much like Eren in moments like this. Gentle even while breaking. Kale reached up instinctively and pressed his forehead softly against hers for one brief second. I'll come back, he promised quietly. Then he stood and turned toward the darkened forest beyond the ruined western line, where distant crimson light was beginning to spread through the rain again like blood dissolving into water. Somewhere out there, the mage was preparing the next move. And this time, he was no longer trying to destroy the forest first. He was trying to destroy the people holding it together. The forest answered, and everyone saw it. The pulse from the fragment chamber spread violently through the sanctuary beneath the roots, racing outward like light through living veins. Ancient pathways that had been collapsing moments earlier suddenly blazed alive beneath the battlefield, while roots erupted upward across the western ridge hard enough to split entire Virolith formations apart. Massive trees shifted violently through the rain-dark woods while wolves burst from the deeper forest with renewed fury, driving enemy soldiers backward through collapsing pathways. Overhead, thousands of black birds spiraled downward through the storm like a living shadow, swallowing the battlefield whole. For the first time since the invasion began, the forest did not merely delay death. It pushed the enemy back. Hard. Kale stood frozen beneath the glowing fragment chamber, while pale green light reflected across the trembling roots surrounding them. Beside him, Eren stared wide-eyed at the roots coiling instinctively around his hands. Before, racing upward through the sanctuary walls to join the battle beyond. Fear and wonder tangled visibly across the boy's face. I didn't do that, he whispered weakly. No. Sylvaris answered quietly from across the chamber. Silver eyes remained fixed on the glowing fragment overhead, while the sanctuary continued shaking around them. The forest did. Silence settled heavily afterward, because everyone there understood what they had just witnessed, even weakened, even dying, a single fragment still carried enough power to reshape an entire battlefield. And for the first time since entering the sanctuary, something shifted visibly inside Sylvaris's expression. Not greed. Not yet. Realization. Above them, distant screams echoed through the western line as Virolith soldiers began retreating beyond the lower ridge under relentless attacks from roots and beasts. Riven burst into the sanctuary moments later covered in rain and mud, breathing hard. They're falling back. Disbelief still lingered openly across his face. The roots sealed the breach completely. We pushed them beyond the lower ridge. Kale's expression hardened slightly. Retreating. Not defeated, but enough for breathing room. Outside, the forest's pulse slowly weakened again after the burst of synchronization, trembling through the roots like exhaustion after overexertion. The fragment had forced the forest awake temporarily, but at a cost. Kale could feel it. Every miracle now came with pain afterward. Sylvaris noticed that too. Kale saw the calculation behind his eyes sharpening slowly as he looked back toward the glowing fragment chamber overhead. That was only one fragment? He asked quietly. Kale's gaze shifted toward him immediately. Yes, silence followed, because suddenly everyone there understood the same terrifying possibility. If one fragment could force the forest to repel an entire assault, then what would happen if Virolith fully synchronized with the core itself? For the first time since the war began, even Silvarus looked genuinely unsettled by the answer. Then his expression hardened, decision settling visibly behind his silver eyes. My forces move fully into the western line. Tonight, he said quietly. Even Riven looked surprised. Until now, Silvarus had always fought carefully, preserving strength, keeping portions of his forces away from direct confrontation. No longer. If Virolith controls the complete core, Silvarus continued while looking toward the fragment chamber one final time. There won't be enough left of this world for anyone else afterward. Kale studied him silently for several seconds before finally nodding once. Uneasy trust. Temporary but real. Above ground, soldiers were already rebuilding shattered barricades beneath the rain while wounded fighters were carried deeper into the inner lines for treatment. For the first time in days, the screaming outside had quieted. Not peace. Only pause. But everyone in the forest clung to it desperately. Later that night, fires burned softly across the clearing outside Aaron's cottage while exhausted soldiers rested beside damaged roots and shattered stone. Rain tapped gently against the rooftops. While healers moved quietly between rows of wounded fighters finally given a chance to breathe, the forest itself seemed quieter now too. Not healed, only resting. Like a wounded creature dragging air painfully into its lungs after nearly drowning. Kale stood beneath the porch watching the darkened woods beyond the ridge, while Aaron carefully wrapped fresh bandages around his arm beneath dim lantern light. The Omega's fingers trembled faintly from exhaustion, though he tried to hide it. Kale noticed anyway. He always noticed now. You should rest, he said quietly. Aaron didn't look up. So should you. Kale almost answered before footsteps approached through the rain outside. Riven entered first carrying several soaked records wrapped carefully in cloth, while another figure followed silently behind him beneath the lantern glow. Older, thin, dressed in dark Virolith robes marked with faded silver embroidery. The moment Kale saw him, his expression sharpened instantly. Saren, the older man lowered his hood slowly. Exhaustion and guilt carved deep lines across his face, while rainwater dripped softly from gray-streaked hair. Aaron immediately moved closer toward Aaron instinctively while Riven's hand rested near his sword. No one trusted a Virolith advisor appearing alone in the middle of the night. Saren's gaze settled briefly on Kale before lowering again. I came because there won't be much time left soon. Silence tightened through the cottage immediately. Kale's voice turned cold. You worked beside the council. Saren nodded once. For years. Then you helped destroy this forest too. The older man closed his eyes briefly at that. Not denial. Acceptance. Yes. The honesty somehow made the room even quieter. Aaron watched him carefully now. Tension visible beneath his exhaustion. Saren slowly unwrapped the soaked records across the table, while rain continued softly outside. Old ritual documents covered in faded crimson markings spread beneath the lantern light. One name repeated again and again across the pages. Valor Ashwin. The moment Aaron saw it, his face lost what little color remained. Kale noticed instantly. You know him. Aaron's breathing turned uneven. One trembling hand tightened against the edge of the table, while old fear surfaced visibly behind his eyes. Saren answered quietly before Aaron could force himself to speak. Valor wasn't born Virolith. Kale's gaze sharpened. Saren slowly looked toward the ritual notes spread across the table. He was an outside scholar. Synchronization research. Memory manipulation. Pheromone suppression. Another silence settled heavily afterward, because suddenly too many things connected together. At once, Kale's jaw tightened slowly. The drug, Saren nodded once. Guilt flickered openly across his tired expression now. Valor created it. Thunder rolled softly beyond the forest outside while no one moved. Aaron lowered his gaze toward the ritual notes, fingers trembling visibly now. Saren continued more quietly. The council allowed the trials because they feared what Kale might become if he opposed them. Kale's entire expression went still, dangerously still. So they broke him first. Saren looked away, because there was no defense for that truth. Another silence followed before Aaron finally spoke softly, voice strained almost to breaking. The side effects, Saren's face tightened. Painfully, intentional. The word landed like a blade through the room. Kale stopped breathing for half a second. Saren forced himself to continue anyway. Valor wanted emotional instability, memory fractures, aggression spikes, isolation. Rain continued softly against the roof overhead while the lantern light flickered weakly across the table between them. He believed the damaged air would be easier for the council to control. Kale's hands clenched slowly at his sides hard enough for his knuckles to pale. Suddenly so many years of confusion, rage, and emptiness crashed violently together inside his chest all at once. Aaron looked toward him instinctively then, fear flashing across his exhausted expression. Not fear of Kale. Fear for him. Saren lowered his head quietly beneath the weight of the silence surrounding them. I should have stopped it. No one answered immediately, because outside, beyond the resting fires and trembling roots of the wounded forest, the war had suddenly become something far more personal than survival. The forest was finally quiet. Not healed, not safe. Only quiet in the fragile way wounded things sometimes become after surviving too much pain at once. Rain drifted softly through the ancient trees surrounding the inner sanctuary, while exhausted soldiers slept beside dying fires and shattered barricades rebuilt from roots and stone. For the first time in days, no screams echoed through the western ridge. Even the forest itself seemed to breathe more slowly now, trembling faintly beneath the earth like a creature conserving what little strength remained. Inside the cottage near the inner pathways, dim lantern light flickered softly across scattered maps, ritual notes, and blood-stained bandages spread across the wooden table, while silence lingered heavily between everyone gathered there. Kale stood near the far wall with both hands braced against the edge of the table, eyes lowered toward the faded ritual pages Saren had brought from Virolith archives hours earlier. He had barely spoken since then. The realization still sat inside him like poison spreading slowly through old wounds. The memory loss, the instability, the years of violent emotional fractures tearing through his mind whenever fragments of Aaron surfaced unexpectedly. None of it had been accidental. Someone had designed it, planned it carefully enough to turn his own mind into a prison. Kale's jaw tightened slowly. He remembered nights waking unable to breathe from rage he couldn't explain. Moments where emptiness inside him had felt so unbearable he nearly destroyed everything around him just trying to silence it. And all this time, Virolith had watched it happen knowingly. Across the room, Saren lowered his gaze quietly beneath the weight of Kale's silence. The older man looked exhausted in a way deeper than physical fatigue now. Guilt carved itself visibly through every line across his face. Valor believed emotional attachment weakened leadership, he said softly after a long silence. The council agreed. Kale laughed once beneath his breath. Cold, humorless. So they erased mine. Saren's expression tightened painfully. They wanted control. Kale finally lifted his eyes then, and something in them looked frighteningly calm now. No, he answered quietly. They wanted obedience. Silence settled again after that. Even Riven remained still near the doorway while rain tapped softly against the windows outside. Aaron watched Kale carefully from across the table, fear and heartbreak twisting quietly together behind exhausted eyes. Because this was worse somehow than watching Kale angry. Anger still burned. This felt hollow instead. Tired in a way that made him look older than before. Then Kale suddenly pushed away from the table and stepped outside into the rain without another word. Aaron moved instinctively to follow before Saren stopped him gently. Let him breathe. Aaron hesitated only briefly before ignoring the advice entirely and stepping outside anyway. The rain had softened to a quiet mist across the clearing, while roots trembled faintly beneath the earth around the resting campfires. Kale stood near the edge of the woods staring toward the dark western ridge where distant crimson lights still flickered faintly through the fog beyond the battlefield. Aaron approached slowly until he stopped beside him beneath the dripping branches overhead. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, Kale exhaled quietly without looking toward him. I thought something inside me was wrong. The words landed softly in the rain between them. Honest in a way Kale almost never allowed himself to be. Aaron's chest tightened painfully. Kale's voice lowered slightly afterward. Every time I tried remembering you, it felt like my mind was tearing itself apart. Another pause. Heavier this time. I hated myself for it. Aaron looked toward him immediately then, eyes stinging unexpectedly at the exhaustion hidden beneath those words, because Kale truly had believed he was broken, not manipulated, not harmed. Broken. Slowly, Aaron stepped closer before resting one trembling hand carefully against Kale's arm. You survived it. Kale finally looked at him then. Rainwater clung to dark strands of hair falling across his forehead, while exhaustion shadowed heavily beneath his eyes. Barely. Something inside Aaron cracked quietly at that answer, because for the first time since Kale lost his memories, he was finally seeing the damage underneath the armor instead of the anger protecting it. Before Aaron could answer, soft footsteps approached behind them through the damp grass. Kale stood silently near the porch wrapped in a blanket far too large for his small frame, while Leora leaned sleepily against his shoulder beside him. Even half asleep. The children had come looking for them. Aaron followed moments later carrying one of the lanterns while trying very hard to look awake despite exhaustion dragging visibly at his movements. Kale straightened slightly immediately. Instinct. Always instinct when it came to them. Kale looked quietly toward him before asking in a small, tired voice, "Does it hurt less now?" Silence followed. Kale frowned slightly. "What does?" Kale's silver-gray eyes lifted toward him calmly. Remembering. The question hit harder than anyone expected. Kale stared at him for a long second before finally answering honestly. "No." Another soft silence settled over the clearing afterward while rain drifted gently through the trees overhead. Then Kale slowly crouched in front of the children, exhaustion finally visible openly across his face now instead of hidden behind command and anger. "But I think," he paused briefly, searching for words he was not used to saying aloud. "I think it hurts less when you're all here." Aaron immediately looked away as if pretending not to hear something embarrassing, while Leora smiled faintly against Kale's shoulder. Even Aaron froze slightly beside him at the quiet sincerity in Kale's voice, because that was the closest thing to vulnerability he had allowed anyone to see in years. Later that night, after the children finally fell asleep beside the fire inside the cottage, Saren spread several older ritual maps across the table beneath dim lantern light, while Kale, Riven, Silvaris, and Aaron gathered around silently. Many synchronization pathways across the forest had already been marked black, where corruption had fully spread. Too many. Saren's expression darkened as he pointed toward a series of faded crimson symbols near the northern ruins beyond the lower ridge. Valor's rituals aren't self-sustaining. Kale's gaze sharpened immediately. Saren continued quietly. The corruption he spreads through the pathways has to remain linked directly to him. Riven frowned slightly. Meaning? Saren looked toward the fragmented pathways marked across the map. Every large-scale assault weakens him too. Silence fell instantly around the table. Even Silvaris straightened slightly at that. Saren tapped one specific symbol near the northern ruins. Valor stabilizes his synchronization through external ritual anchors. Aaron's expression changed subtly. Realization surfacing first. The crimson lanterns. Saren nodded once. They're not only spreading corruption, they're feeding it back into him. Kale's eyes narrowed slowly as pieces finally connected together in his mind. Every major assault Valor launched always centered around those ritual carriers embedded through the battlefield lines. Saren's voice lowered further. Destroy enough anchors at once. Another pause. And the backlash could sever his synchronization temporarily. Riven looked toward the maps again. Enough to stop the assaults. Maybe more than that, Silvaris said. Quietly before anyone else could answer. Silver eyes remained fixed on the marked ritual pathways across the table now. Calculating. If his synchronization collapses during a major ritual, he looked slowly toward Kale. He becomes vulnerable. Silence settled heavily after that, because for the first time since the war began, they finally had something they had lacked from the beginning. Not hope. Something more dangerous. A weakness. The forest showed them the way. Dawn had not fully broken yet when Kale's strike team moved through the lower pathways beneath the western ridge. Fog drifted thick between the ancient trees, while pale roots glowed faintly beneath wet earth. guiding them silently through hidden passages the forest had only just reopened hours earlier. The forest was still weak. Everyone could feel it in the sluggish tremor beneath the ground. But it was helping them now. Cautiously, desperately, Kale moved at the front beside Riven while Silvaris and several of his elite soldiers guarded the rear formation farther behind. No banners. No heavy armor. This was not an army marching to war. It was a knife sliding quietly toward a throat. Somewhere beyond the ridge, hidden among corrupted pathways spreading through the outer woods, Valor's ritual anchors remained active. Crimson lanterns suspended from twisted branches like bleeding stars inside the fog, each one feeding corruption through the forest and returning synchronization back toward Valor himself. Destroy enough of them at once. And for the first time since the war began, the mage would feel pain instead of control. Kale tightened his grip around the hilt of his sword slightly, as another weak pulse trembled beneath the roots. Beside him, Kale suddenly slowed near the edge of the pathway. The youngest child had insisted on coming despite every argument against it. And eventually even Kale had stopped refusing once Aaron quietly pointed out the truth. The forest trusted Kale more than anyone now. Silver-gray eyes lifted toward the deeper woods ahead, while roots beneath the pathway twitched faintly around his boots. 3 ahead, he whispered softly. 1 farther north. Riven immediately signaled for the formation to split. Aaron moved instantly beside Kale despite still looking far too young to stand inside a battlefield at all, while Leora remained farther behind near the hidden recovery point with Aaron and several healers. Kale had argued against bringing any of the children into the operation at first, fiercely, until Aaron finally looked him directly in the eyes the night before and said quietly, "You can't keep asking us to survive a war you won't let us help end." Kale still hated how right that had sounded. The forest thickened around them as the strike team moved deeper beyond the lower ridge where corruption had spread strongest. Black sap dripped slowly down twisted bark, while crimson veins pulsed faintly beneath exposed roots. Even the air felt sick here, colder somehow. Then they saw the first anchor. A crimson lantern suspended beneath a dead tree at the center of a corrupted ritual circle carved directly into the earth. The roots surrounding it had turned black entirely, writhing weakly like dying nerves beneath the mud. Kale immediately understood why Saren had called them anchors. The lantern wasn't simply spreading corruption. It was binding the pathway to Valor directly, feeding synchronization through the forest itself like poison through veins. Silvaris stepped closer toward the edge of the ritual circle, silver eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the crimson sigils pulsing beneath the lantern. Destroying it carelessly could trigger backlash. Suggestions? Riven asked quietly. Silvaris looked toward Kale instead. Can the forest separate the pathway from the anchor? Silence followed briefly while everyone looked toward the youngest child. Kale stared quietly at the corrupted roots twisting beneath the lantern before slowly kneeling against the wet earth. Pale fingers pressed carefully against the roots while silver-gray eyes closed. For several terrifying seconds, nothing happened. Then the roots trembled, slowly, painfully. Black corruption spread violently upward along several twisting branches before pale green light suddenly pushed back through them. Like life fighting its way through rot, Kale's breathing immediately turned uneven. Kale moved toward him instinctively before Aaron's earlier warning echoed sharply through his mind. Don't interrupt synchronization once it begins. The roots surrounding the lantern twisted violently beneath the earth while Kale's hands shook harder against the mud. Now, he whispered weakly. Kale moved instantly. One strike shattered the lantern apart. Crimson fire exploded violently through the clearing before black smoke tore upward through the trees like something screaming soundlessly into the sky. The entire forest trembled. Far away beyond the ridge, another pulse echoed through the roots beneath their feet. Unstable. Interrupted. Valor had felt that. Riven looked sharply toward the deeper woods. Move. They destroyed the second anchor faster. Aaron forced roots upward from beneath the ritual circle, while Silvaris's soldiers severed the corrupted sigils surrounding it before Kale shattered the lantern directly through its center. Again the forest trembled violently afterward, stronger this time. Farther away, crimson light flickered visibly through the fog as corrupted pathways destabilized across the battlefield. Somewhere beyond the forest, Valor's synchronization network was beginning to fracture. Then everything changed at the third anchor. The moment they reached the clearing, Kale stopped walking entirely. Fear spread visibly across his face for the first time since entering the woods. "No," he whispered softly. Kale's instincts reacted immediately. "What is it?" Kale looked toward the center of the clearing where the final lantern hung suspended beneath enormous dead branches wrapped completely in blackened roots. Except this ritual circle was different, larger, deeper, alive. The corrupted roots beneath it pulsed visibly like a heartbeat through the mud, while crimson mist drifted slowly upward around the lantern itself. Kale's expression hardened instantly. This wasn't only an anchor. It was feeding something. Then the mist moved. Figures stepped silently from the fog surrounding the clearing. Cloaked soldiers wearing dark virulith armor marked with crimson sigils glowing faintly across their chests, waiting. The ambush hit instantly. Corrupted roots exploded upward beneath the strike team, while crimson chains lashed violently through the fog toward Kale first. Kale intercepted them immediately, sword flashing through the mist hard enough to sever the corrupted bindings before they reached the child. Battle erupted across the clearing beneath twisted black branches, while the forest itself convulsed violently around them. Silvarus's soldiers clashed against virulith guards while Aaron slammed both hands into the earth hard enough to send roots tearing upward beneath enemy formations. But the corrupted pathways reacted faster here, stronger. Valor had prepared this sight personally. Kale realized at the moment crimson sigils ignited across the clearing beneath their feet. "Destroy the lantern," Riven shouted over the chaos. But every time someone approached the ritual circle, the corrupted roots lashed upward violently to protect it. Then Kale saw Kale collapse to one knee beside the edge of the clearing, blood spilling suddenly from his nose, while both hands pressed against the trembling roots beneath the mud. Kale. Fear ripped sharply through Kale's chest as he cut through another corrupted soldier before reaching him. The child's entire body shook violently now. "It's connected," Kale whispered weakly through uneven breaths. "This one goes directly to him." Silence crashed through Kale's thoughts for half a second. Directly to Valor. This wasn't only an anchor. It was the central synchronization relay. Destroy this one, and the backlash would hit Valor directly. But the ritual circle was feeding both ways now. And judging by the blood running down Kale's face, the connection was fighting back. Kale looked toward the pulsing crimson lantern hanging beneath the dead branches overhead, while battle roared violently around them. Then, somewhere far beyond the battlefield, the forest trembled again, not in fear this time, waiting. The forest screamed when the relay shattered. The moment Kale's blade pierced through the crimson lantern suspended beneath the dead branches overhead, the entire clearing exploded with violent light. Corrupted roots convulsed beneath the earth while crimson fire tore upward through the trees like a wound splitting open across the sky itself. Every soldier in the clearing staggered as the synchronization backlash ripped outward in all directions at once. Kale barely had time to reach Kale before the child collapsed completely against the mud beside the ritual circle. Blood spilled from the corner of Kale's mouth now, while trembling roots wrapped desperately around his small body, as if the forest itself was trying to hold him. Together, Kale. Fear hit harder than any battlefield wound Kale had taken in years. He dropped immediately beside him, while chaos erupted across the clearing around them. Farther back, Silvarus's soldiers clashed violently against retreating virulith guards, while corrupted pathways collapsed beneath twisting roots and shattered sigils. Above them, black birds exploded upward through the storm-dark sky in enormous, spiraling swarms, while ancient trees groaned, like living things waking from agony. The relay had broken. Valor had felt it. Kale pressed one hand against Kale's chest instinctively, while the boy's breathing came shallow and uneven beneath his fingers. Silver-gray eyes flickered weakly open before immediately squeezing shut again in pain. "It hurts," Kale whispered faintly. Kale's chest tightened so sharply it almost stopped him breathing. Aaron reached them seconds later alongside Riven, while roots continued convulsing violently beneath the clearing. The Omega immediately dropped beside Kale, trembling hands glowing faintly green as he pressed them carefully against the child's forehead. The backlash overloaded the synchronization. Aaron said quietly through uneven breaths. Fear flickered visibly behind exhausted eyes now despite how hard he tried to stay calm. He still connected to the pathways. Another violent tremor shook the clearing hard enough to split part of the ritual circle apart beside them. Farther beyond the ridge, crimson light suddenly flickered erratically. Through the distant battlefield for the first time since the war began, unstable, interrupted, somewhere far away, Valor's network was collapsing unevenly through the corrupted pathways now. But the central relay had shattered. Sylvaris appeared through the chaos moments later, silver cloaks streaked with mud and blood, while several of his soldiers dragged wounded fighters back toward the forest line behind him. His eyes immediately moved toward Kale. Is he alive? Kale looked up sharply enough that even Sylvaris stopped walking for half a second. He will be. The answer came colder than intended. Fear always sharpened Kale into something dangerous. Sylvaris seemed to understand that immediately, because he simply nodded once before turning toward the dying ritual circle nearby. Crimson sigils across the clearing were flickering violently now, struggling to maintain synchronization through broken pathways. Then suddenly every remaining lantern fragment ignited at once. The clearing exploded with another pulse of crimson light hard enough to send soldiers crashing backward through the mud, while corrupted roots burst violently upward across the battlefield. Kale pulled Kale instinctively against his chest as the earth shook beneath them. And then the voice came. Distant, furious, everywhere at once. Who did this? The sound ripped through the clearing like claws dragging across bone. Several soldiers collapsed immediately from the pressure alone, while the remaining corrupted roots convulsed violently through the mud around them. Valor, not physically present yet, but connected enough through the synchronization backlash for his fury to reach them directly. Even Sylvaris visibly stiffened beside the ruined ritual circle, while crimson mist spread slowly upward through the clearing around them. Kale slowly stood again with one arm still supporting Kale against his chest while dark hair whipped violently across his face beneath the storm winds now tearing through the forest. I did. He answered coldly into the darkness surrounding them. Silence followed for half a second. Then the forest convulsed violently. Every corrupted pathway across the clearing ignited crimson at once while roots exploded upward beneath the strike team from all directions. Valor's retaliation hit instantly, Riven shouted, for everyone to fall back as corrupted soldiers emerged. Through the fog surrounding the clearing again, moving unnaturally fast now under direct synchronization control, battle erupted harder than before. This was no longer an ambush. This was Valor himself forcing the battlefield to answer him through rage alone. Kale handed the barely conscious Kale toward Aaron immediately, before stepping back into the chaos without hesitation. Roots tore upward beneath his feet, while crimson chains lashed through the storm-dark, clearing toward him from every direction. He cut through them brutally, driving forward through collapsing corruption toward the remaining ritual center at the heart of the shattered clearing. If enough synchronization still remained here for Valor to attack directly, then part of the network was still alive, and Kale intended to finish it. Nearby, Aaron slammed both hands into the mud hard enough to send roots tearing violently beneath advancing Virolith soldiers, while blood ran openly down one side of his face from synchronization strain. Too much. They were all pushing too hard now. Aaron. Riven caught him before the boy collapsed completely beside the broken ritual circle. Farther back, Leora had arrived with the second support group and immediately dropped beside wounded soldiers already flooding back toward the forest line. Pale healing light trembled visibly around her exhausted hands while tears mixed openly with rainwater down her cheeks. She was still healing anyway, always healing. Then another pulse tore violently through the battlefield, this one different, sharper. Suddenly, every corrupted root across the clearing froze, only for a second, but long enough for everyone to feel it. Interruption. Somewhere far beyond the forest, Valor himself had finally suffered backlash directly through the shattered relay. The crimson synchronization faltered visibly through the remaining pathways like a heartbeat skipping inside the earth. Sylvaris noticed it immediately. So did Kale. Now, Silvaris shouted sharply toward the remaining fighters. Kale moved instantly. Together they drove through the collapsing ritual center, while corrupted pathways flickered erratically beneath their feet. Kale's sword tore directly through the final remaining sigil at the center of the clearing, while Silvaris drove silver-marked blades into the surrounding anchor stones simultaneously. The entire battlefield exploded. Crimson fire erupted upward through the shattered clearing, while corrupted roots screamed violently beneath the earth. Somewhere far away beyond the battlefield, something finally broke. The pressure crushing the forest for weeks suddenly faltered hard enough that every surviving pathway across the western ridge pulsed green in response. For the first time since the war began, the forest itself pushed corruption backward instead of merely surviving it. Beasts roared through the deeper woods while ancient roots surged violently through broken pathways reclaiming ground lost weeks earlier. And then, through the collapsing synchronization tearing itself apart across the battlefield, Kale felt it. Another presence, colder than the storm. Watching him, slowly, crimson mist gathered at the far edge of the ruined clearing beneath the dead branches while every surviving corrupted root bent instinctively toward it. The battlefield went unnaturally still. Even the forest seemed to hesitate. Then a tall figure stepped slowly through the crimson fog, wearing dark robes marked with glowing ritual scars stretching visibly across pale hands and throat. Calm silver eyes lifted toward Kale across the shattered clearing, while blood ran slowly from one corner of the man's mouth beneath the storm-dark sky. Valar Ashwin had finally come in person. Valar Ashwin did not look like a monster. That was the first thought that crossed Kale's mind as the mage stepped slowly through the crimson mist gathering at the edge of the ruined clearing. No towering armor. No monstrous transformation. Only a tall man in dark ritual robes stained by rain and blood, while glowing crimson scars crawled visibly beneath pale skin along his throat and hands like cracks spreading through glass. Calm silver eyes lifted toward the battlefield with terrifying steadiness despite the blood still trailing. Slowly from the corner of his mouth after the backlash. Behind him, corrupted roots writhed violently beneath the mud as though trying desperately to reconnect themselves to his broken synchronization. Valar looked at the shattered relay first, then at Kale holding an unconscious Kale protectively against his chest, and finally toward Aaron kneeling nearby with trembling hands still glowing faintly green from stabilizing the child's pathways. Something unreadable flickered briefly across Valar's face then, curiosity perhaps, before vanishing completely beneath cold composure again. "So," he said softly, voice carrying strangely clearly through the ruined clearing despite the storm around them. "This is what the forest chose instead of obedience." Kale's grip tightened instinctively around his sword. Every surviving root around the clearing trembled uneasily beneath the earth now that Valar stood physically inside the battlefield at last. Even wounded, the forest recognized him, hated him. Valar slowly stepped farther into the clearing while corrupted soldiers behind him remained unnaturally still beneath his synchronization control. "You destroyed months of ritual preparation tonight," he continued calmly while his gaze settled briefly on the broken crimson lantern scattered across the mud. "Impressive." Silvaris moved subtly closer toward the fragment container strapped beside one of his soldiers, while silver eyes studied Valar carefully beneath the rain. Calculating. Always calculating. Kale noticed anyway. He noticed everything now. Valar's attention shifted back toward him afterward. "Tell me," he said quietly, "does it comfort you knowing none of your suffering was accidental?" The clearing fell silent except for rain striking shattered roots. Kale's entire expression went still, dangerous stillness. Valar smiled faintly at the reaction, not mockingly, academically almost. "You were fascinating to study." Aaron visibly stiffened beside Kale while Aaron's roots surged instinctively upward around the clearing in response to the sudden spike of fury ripping through Kale's pheromones. Valar continued anyway. The strongest air Virulith had produced in generations, and yet all it took was isolation, memory fracture, and emotional instability to reduce you into something controllable. Kale moved before anyone else could react. One violent step shattered the mud beneath his boots, while his sword flashed toward Valar's throat hard enough to split rainwater apart in the air itself. Corrupted roots exploded upward instantly between them. The impact shook the entire clearing as Kale's blade carved directly through twisting black roots only inches from Valor's neck before synchronization chains lashed violently around the sword arm, trying to pin him. In place, Kale tore free through sheer force while crimson sparks erupted across the battlefield around them. Valor did not step back, did not even flinch. Silver eyes remained locked calmly onto Kale's face while the corrupted roots surrounding them convulsed harder beneath the strain of broken synchronization. There it is, Valor whispered almost gently. The rage they feared. Kale's next strike came harder, faster, brutal enough to split through another wall of corrupted roots before. Riven intercepted several crimson chains flying toward Kale's blind side at the last second. Battle erupted again instantly around the clearing, while surviving Virulith soldiers charged forward beneath Valor's synchronization control. Silvarus's forces collided against them through mud and shattered roots while beasts from the deeper forest burst violently through the collapsing pathways overhead. Wolves dragged corrupted soldiers into the fog while blackbirds descended in screaming swarms. Through the storm-dark sky, the forest itself had joined the battle fully now. Nearby, Aaron pressed desperately against Kale's chest, while pale green synchronization flickered unevenly beneath the child's skin. He's burning through too much connection. Aaron whispered shakily toward Leora, who had already dropped beside them with trembling healing light surrounding both hands. Fear spread visibly across her exhausted face now. I can't stabilize all of it. Another violent pulse suddenly tore through the clearing then. Valor staggered for the first time. Only slightly, but enough. Blood spilled sharply from his mouth again, while crimson sigils across the battlefield flickered unstable beneath the broken relay backlash. Kale saw it instantly. Weakness. Valor's synchronization network had not recovered. Push him. Riven shouted through the chaos. Kale attacked again immediately alongside Aaron's surging roots while Silvarus's soldiers severed corrupted sigils embedded through the battlefield mud. Under combined pressure, Valor was finally forced backward across the ruined clearing for the first time since appearing. Rain lashed violently across the battlefield now, while synchronization pulses exploded erratically through the remaining corrupted pathways. Farther beyond the western ridge, Virulith. Formations were already collapsing as ancient roots reclaimed territory faster than corrupted rituals could maintain control. The war was turning. Valor realized it too. Silver eyes lifted slowly toward the deeper forest beyond the clearing, where pale green light pulsed stronger through ancient pathways now that the relay had fallen. Then, for the first time, genuine frustration cracked visibly through his calm expression. You think reclaiming the forest changes anything? Crimson synchronization exploded outward from him violently enough to force everyone backward through the clearing as ritual scars across his body ignited like burning veins beneath pale skin. The air itself screamed under the pressure. The core is already awakening. Silence crashed through the battlefield for half a second. Kale's eyes narrowed instantly. Valor smiled faintly through blood running down his chin now. Virulith began full synchronization hours ago. Fear hit colder than any blade. Saren's face visibly drained of color near the forest line. No, the older man whispered. Valor looked toward Kale again afterward. Every moment you wasted protecting this dying forest. Another pulse tore violently through the clearing as corrupted pathways ignited across the battlefield like open wounds. The council moved closer to controlling its heart. Kale understood immediately then. The relay attacks had slowed Valor, but the council had used the distraction to begin. Synchronizing directly with the core itself, somewhere deeper beyond the northern ruins, inside Virulith territory. The real battle had already started. Then suddenly the forest convulsed violently beneath everyone's feet. Ancient roots split apart across the clearing, while an agonized roar thundered through the pathways strong enough to freeze every beast and soldier alike. Kale screamed. The sound tore straight through Kale's chest as the child arched violently against Aaron's arms, while silver-gray eyes flashed bright green beneath unstable synchronization. The core. Kale gasped weakly through the overload. Terror spread openly across his face now. They're hurting it. The forest roared again. This time not in anger. Pain. Unbearable pain. Aaron's expression changed instantly as realization hit him harder than anyone else there. If the synchronization completes, His voice shook visibly now. The forest dies. Silence followed for only one terrible heartbeat before Kale moved immediately. We go now. Riven looked sharply toward him through the chaos. Kale, now. The Alpha's voice cracked across the battlefield hard enough that even the surviving beasts stilled instinctively beneath the pressure of it. Kale turned toward Sylvaris next while rain and crimson light tore violently through the clearing around them. Can your forces break through the northern ridge? Sylvaris hesitated only briefly before nodding once. Yes. Kale's gaze shifted back toward Valor afterward. The mage stood motionless now beneath the storm-dark sky, while blood continued dripping slowly from ritual scars crawling beneath pale skin. Despite the damage, despite the backlash, Silver Eyes remained terrifyingly calm, because Valor knew something everyone else was only beginning to understand. This war was no longer about surviving the forest. It was about reaching the core before Virulith destroyed it completely. Then Valor smiled faintly one final time beneath the rain. Run quickly, Kale. Another violent pulse shook the forest beneath their feet. Your family is already killing the heart you're trying so desperately to save. The forest chose its final side. The northern ruins burned beneath a sky ripped apart by crimson lightning, while the last battle swallowed everything beneath the storm-dark dawn. Ancient towers collapsed into shattered ritual circles as roots exploded upward through the battlefield hard enough to split stone pathways apart, like cracked bones. Wolves from the deeper forest tore through corrupted Virulith soldiers beneath collapsing arches, while enormous black ravens spiraled overhead in screaming swarms. Glowing spirits surged across the battlefield like rivers of pale green light weaving between wounded fighters and shattered trees alike. Even the ancient forest itself had awakened fully now. Branches groaned like living giants rising against executioners, while spectral stags charged directly through collapsing enemy formations beside Kale's forces. The forest was dying, but it had chosen to die fighting beside them instead of kneeling. Kale broke through the final northern gate alongside Riven and Aaron, while Sylvaris's silver-cloaked warriors shattered the remaining Virulith defenses from behind. Farther back, Leora and the healers struggled desperately to stabilize the wounded beneath trembling roots, while Aaron remained beside Kale near the sanctuary entrance, pale green synchronization flickering weakly around both their exhausted bodies now. Everyone was breaking. Everyone. And the core felt it too. Suspended above the shattered sanctuary like a living star wrapped in chains of crimson synchronization, the core pulsed violently through the battlefield beneath it. Every pulse shook the ruins. Every pulse sounded wrong. Somehow, painful. Beneath it, the surviving Virulith council members continued forcing synchronization through massive ritual circles carved directly into the sanctuary floor, while Valor stood at the center guiding the ritual despite blood running openly from cracked ritual scars spreading across his pale skin. He looked weaker now, unstable, the backlash from the destroyed relay still tearing through him visibly. But he kept forcing synchronization anyway. Another pulse exploded upward. Immediately afterward, dozens of roots across the battlefield blackened and split apart, while several forest beasts collapsed screaming beneath corruption flooding through the pathways. Kale cried out weakly beside Aaron, silver-gray eyes flashing violently green through tears and pain. It's rejecting them, he gasped shakily. The core doesn't want them. Kale understood instantly. The core was alive, and Virulith's forced synchronization was slowly killing it instead of controlling it. Valor saw realization spread across Kale's face and smiled faintly through blood staining his mouth. Then let it die, he answered coldly. A dying world can still be ruled. Before Kale could move, Aaron stepped forward. Weakly through the shaking sanctuary while roots surrounding the battlefield slowly bent toward him instead of the ritual circle beneath the core. No. Aaron whispered softly. Pale green light trembled beneath cracked skin along his throat and hands now. It was never yours to rule. The forest answered instantly. Every root beneath the sanctuary surged upward at once while ancient trees beyond the battlefield roared like living things awakening from centuries of agony. Pale spirits burst from the deeper woods in enormous waves while glowing fox-shaped creatures darted through collapsing pathways and spectral birds exploded through the storm-dark sky. The forest god had awakened fully, not as one being, but through every living thing still connected to the forest itself. The battlefield became war between forced control and willing resonance. Kale moved immediately through the chaos toward the ritual sanctuary beneath the core, while Aaron slammed both hands into the shattered earth, hard enough to send roots exploding upward through the remaining synchronization pillars surrounding it. Riven and Saren drove through surviving Virolith guards beside him, while Sylvaris followed close behind. Silver eyes fixed upward toward the glowing core overhead with growing intensity. The deeper they pushed into the sanctuary, the stronger the core's presence became. Not rage, grief. Unbearable grief pulsing through every broken pathway beneath the ruins. Kale reached the ritual platform. First, one brutal strike severed the nearest synchronization chain binding the core to the sanctuary below. Instantly, the battlefield convulsed violently, while several Virolith council members screamed as synchronization backlash tore through their bodies. Valor staggered hard enough to hit one knee as blood flooded sharply from his mouth. "Stop him!" He roared through the sanctuary while corrupted roots exploded wildly around him. But the forest had already turned completely against Virolith now. Roots shattered ritual circles apart, while ancient branches tore through the collapsing ceiling overhead. Beasts flooded into the sanctuary alongside Kale's forces as the remaining synchronization chains snapped apart one after another beneath Kale's blade. Each broken chain weakened the corruption further, while pale green resonance slowly spread back across the core's surface. All across the battlefield, corrupted pathways collapsed while surviving Virolith soldiers either fled or were dragged beneath reclaiming roots. The war was ending. Kale realized at the moment the final synchronization chain shattered completely and the core pulsed green instead of crimson for the first time in years. The entire battlefield went still. Roots calmed. Spirits slowed. Even the storm above the sanctuary weakened slightly as though the forest itself had finally drawn a full breath after nearly drowning. Then the core moved, slowly descending through the fading synchronization storms toward Kale. Pale green light wrapped around his trembling hands the moment the core touched his palms. Warmth flooded violently through him. Memories, grief. Aaron waiting beside dying trees through endless seasons. The children laughing inside the cottage before war swallowed the forest whole. Quiet nights beneath glowing roots where the world had briefly felt safe. The core accepted him because it recognized protection instead of ownership. Around the sanctuary, exhausted soldiers slowly lowered their weapons while the forest quieted for the first time since the war began. Valor collapsed fully beneath shattered stone nearby. Synchronization destroyed beyond repair, while crimson scars dimmed slowly across his body. Virolith had lost completely, and that was when Sylvaris looked around the sanctuary and realized everyone capable of stopping him was exhausted beyond their limits. Kale barely remained standing. Aaron trembled weakly beside Kale. Aaron and Leora looked drained nearly to collapse. Even the forest itself had spent everything answering the battle, and the core was finally free. Temptation swallowed him whole in a single terrible moment. Sylvaris stepped forward slowly, silver eyes locked entirely on the glowing core resting in Kale's hands now. "Give it to me." Silence spread instantly across the ruined sanctuary. Kale's exhausted gaze lifted toward him sharply, while Riven's expression darkened in disbelief nearby. Even several of Sylvaris's own soldiers stiffened uneasily behind him. But Sylvaris could no longer pull himself back from the edge he had already crossed. After witnessing the core awaken, after seeing an entire forest bend around its power, the thought of walking away empty-handed had become unbearable. "You're too weak to protect it now," he said hoarsely while pale green light reflected hungrily across his face. "All of you are." Kale slowly tightened his grip around the core. "Exhausted but still dangerous. Don't do this." For one brief second, hesitation flickered across Sylvaris's expression. Then greed crushed it completely. He moved instantly. Silver flashed violently through the sanctuary as he lunged directly toward the core in Kale's hands. Kale reacted immediately, but exhaustion slowed him by half a second. Enough. Aaron saw the strike first. Instinct moved faster than thought. The Omega threw himself between them just as the blade drove forward. Silence. Kale felt the impact before he understood it. Aaron's body jerked violently against him, while crimson spread instantly across pale robes beneath the core's fading green light. For one impossible heartbeat, the battlefield froze. Then Aaron screamed. Roots exploded upward across the sanctuary hard enough to tear the shattered floor apart beneath Sylvaris' feet, while Leora's healing light burst violently across the ruins beside a sob ripping from her throat. Kale collapsed to his knees as the entire forest roared through every remaining pathway beneath the battlefield. Sylvaris barely managed to rise before Roots slammed violently around his body, pinning him against collapsing stone while spectral beasts surged toward him through the sanctuary. Horror flashed across his face the moment he looked down and saw the blood covering his blade. Too late. Riven reached him first. Rage exploded through the ruined sanctuary while Roots tightened hard enough to crack stone beneath Sylvaris' body. For one final second, silver eyes lifted toward the glowing core still resting against Kale's chest. Then the roots closed around him completely. Silence followed. Not peace. Judgment. Kale heard none of it. The world had narrowed entirely to the trembling body collapsing into his arms. Aaron. Panic tore violently through him harder than any wound ever had as he dropped beside him. Blood spread rapidly between trembling fingers pressed desperately against the wound, while pale green synchronization flickered dangerously weak beneath cracked skin along Aaron's throat and hands. Far too weak. Aaron's eyes fluttered open barely enough to find Kale's face through. Fading consciousness. One shaking hand reached him weakly. His voice fractured softly beneath shallow breaths. Did we save it? Around them, the forest had finally fallen silent. The core had been reclaimed. Virilith had fallen. The war was over. But none of it mattered because Aaron was dying in Kale's arms while the pale green light beneath his skin faded weaker with every breath. The war ended in silence. No one moved inside the shattered sanctuary after the roots closed around Sylvaris completely. The battlefield that had screamed with corruption, synchronization, and collapsing magic only moments earlier now stood unnaturally still beneath the fading storm. Pale green light drifted softly through broken branches overhead, while ancient roots slowly withdrew beneath the ruined stone, as though the forest itself had finally exhausted the last of its rage. Kale heard none of it. The entire world had narrowed into the trembling body lying in his arms. Aaron. His voice broke on the name this time. No command, no strength. Only fear, real fear. Blood spread rapidly between Kale's shaking fingers pressed desperately against the wound, while pale green synchronization flickered. Weaker beneath cracked skin along Aaron's throat and hands. Far too weak. Every breath sounded shallower than the last. Nearby, Leora fell hard to her knees beside them, while trembling healing light poured uselessly through tear-blurred hands already stained with blood. No. No. No, no. Her voice fractured completely beneath sobs as she tried desperately to stabilize the wound. Aaron stood frozen several steps away, roots still trembling violently around him, while horror spread openly across his face for the first time since the war began. The boy looked younger suddenly, terrified. Papa. The word barely came out above a whisper. Kale collapsed beside Aaron's other side moments later, silver-gray eyes glowing faintly green through tears streaming uncontrollably down his face now, while the forest around them trembled weakly in response to his grief. Please, Kale whispered shakily while clutching Aaron's sleeve with both hands. Please don't leave us. Something inside Kale nearly shattered completely at the sound of it. Aaron's eyes fluttered open weakly at the children's voices. Pain crossed his expression immediately afterward, but even now he still tried to smile for them. Always for them. One trembling hand lifted slowly toward Leora first, brushing weakly against tear-soaked hair. You did so well, he whispered softly. Leora broke completely then, sobbing openly while pressing both hands desperately against his chest as healing light shook violently around her. Aaron's gaze shifted next toward Aaron. The boy still stood frozen beside the ruined sanctuary floor with roots coiling uncontrollably around his legs like frightened animals. Aaron. Aaron's voice weakened further beneath uneven breathing now. Don't carry hatred inside your heart. Aaron dropped instantly to his knees beside him, while tears finally spilled openly down his face. Kale had never seen him cry before. Not once. I can stop it. the boy whispered desperately through broken breaths. While roots surged wildly through the sanctuary around them again. I can fix it. No, Aaron answered softly. Another cough tore painfully through him while blood stained the corner of his mouth. Kale's hands shook harder, immediately trying to steady him. You protect, you don't destroy. Then Aaron looked toward Kale. The youngest child was crying so hard he could barely breathe now, while pale synchronization flickered desperately beneath his skin alongside the grieving forest. Aaron touched his face weakly with trembling fingers. None of this was your fault. Kale shook his head violently through tears. I should have seen him sooner. No, Aaron whispered again. You saved the forest. Silence settled heavily through the sanctuary afterward, except for distant rainwater dripping through shattered stone overhead. Then finally Aaron's gaze lifted toward Kale, and everything else disappeared. The world had always done this to them somehow. Even now, even dying, Kale could still see the same quiet warmth inside exhausted green eyes that had waited for him through years of loneliness and heartbreak beneath dying trees. Kale lowered himself desperately closer while one shaking hand cradled Aaron's face as though terrified he might disappear if he let go for even a second. Don't, he whispered hoarsely. Don't do this to me. Pain crossed Aaron's expression then. Not physical pain, heartbreak. You came back to me, he whispered faintly. That was enough. No. Kale answered instantly, violently. Tears finally broke free down his face for the first time in years while panic closed around his chest harder than any battlefield wound ever had. No, it wasn't enough, Aaron smiled. Weakly anyway. Take care of them for me. The words nearly destroyed Kale completely. Stop talking like that. Kale's voice cracked openly now while his forehead pressed desperately against Aaron's trembling hand. You're staying with us. Aaron's breathing weakened again beneath him. Kale, his voice barely existed anymore now. I loved all four of you, from the very beginning. Leora sobbed harder beside them, while Aaron lowered his head completely against Aaron's arm, trying and failing to hide trembling shoulders. Even Kale could no longer hold back the broken sounds tearing from his chest, while roots across the sanctuary shook with the forest's grief. Then suddenly the core pulsed, soft at first, then brighter. Pale green lights slowly rose through the ruined sanctuary while ancient roots surrounding the battlefield bent downward as though bowing towards something unseen. The entire forest fell completely still. Even the wind stopped moving. And then a voice spoke through the sanctuary itself. Ancient, gentle, vast enough to make the shattered ruins tremble softly beneath it. You have carried this forest alone for too long, my son. Pale green light flooded upward around Aaron's body. Immediately afterward, while the core slowly lifted itself from Kale's trembling hands, every spirit across the battlefield appeared at once through the sanctuary, glowing silently beneath the fading storm, while ancient branches overhead bent lower around them protectively. Kale stared upward in stunned disbelief as the core drifted slowly above Aaron's dying body, while roots wrapped gently around him like living hands. The forest god had finally spoken directly. The forest remembers those who loved it without asking for ownership in return. Light spread across the sanctuary floor in enormous waves while the pale green synchronization beneath Aaron's cracked skin slowly stabilized for the first time since the battle began. Kale felt hope crash violently through him hard enough to almost hurt. Save him, he said instantly, voice breaking completely now. Please. Silence followed briefly beneath the glowing sanctuary. Then the ancient voice answered softly through every root and branch surrounding them. Life cannot return without balance. Kale understood immediately. Before anyone else could speak, he stepped forward beneath the floating core while tears still stained his face openly. Take mine. Shock spread instantly across the sanctuary. Kale. Saren began sharply from nearby, but Kale never looked away from Aaron. Take my years, he repeated hoarsely. Whatever is needed. Pale green light pulsed softly around him while the cord drifted lower between them both. Then your lives shall walk together from this moment onward. Warmth surged violently through Kale's chest immediately afterward. Not pain. Connection. He gasped sharply as pale green light spread from the core into both himself and Aaron simultaneously, while ancient roots wrapped softly around their wrists like vows being sealed by the forest itself. Kale felt part of his own lifespan tear free and flow into the weakening synchronization inside Aaron's body. And suddenly Aaron breathed again, stronger this time. Real breath. Leora cried out in disbelief, while Kale stared openly through tears, and Aaron looked up sharply from the sanctuary floor. Pale green light slowly spread beneath Aaron's skin while the cracked synchronization lines faded little by little. Color returned weakly to his face beneath the sanctuary glow. Then finally exhausted green eyes opened again. Kale nearly collapsed from relief right there beside him. One shaking hand immediately caught Aaron's face, while tears continued falling freely, without restraint now. Aaron looked at him silently for several seconds before weakly touching Kale's wrist where the roots still glowed faintly around them. Realization crossed his expression slowly afterward. "You idiot," he whispered faintly. Kale laughed once through tears and exhaustion. "Broken but real. We die together now." Aaron's eyes filled instantly after that. Around them, the sanctuary slowly brightened as the forest began healing for the first time in years. Corruption withdrew through the deeper pathways while ancient roots stabilized the shattered ruins around them. The war was truly over. Weeks later, Kale reclaimed his position as head of House Virolith. Without resistance. After witnessing the fall of the council and the destruction brought by greed and forced synchronization, the surviving houses no longer dared oppose him. Those who betrayed the forest were stripped of power and exiled, while the remaining bloodlines swore new oaths beneath the restored sanctuary itself. From that day onward, House Virolith would no longer rule over the forest, it would protect it. The guardianship that once belonged only to Aaron would now be carried by the entire house together. And for the first time in countless years, Aaron himself was finally free. Free to leave the forest without fearing it would die behind him, though he still returned often with the children beside him as the pathways slowly healed beneath sunlight instead of corruption now. Months later, laughter once again filled the manor gardens overlooking the recovering woods beyond. Aaron trained beneath ancient trees with roots dancing harmlessly around him, while Leora filled the gardens with glowing flowers restored through healing magic, and Kale sat peacefully among wandering spirits no longer crying in pain.